high, if not higher. So it seems to me that my main reaction is it feels like everyone's responsibilities have just gone up a peg in terms of working with these tools and making them work. If that makes sense, it's almost like vigilance and acuity and some of the skills that are often not always already in evidence now need to be much more so, because there's these tools that could produce more dense, more material that isn't necessarily fit for purpose. So it feels to me like it's a call to action around more human vigilance and skills and acuity and having the broadest relationship to context possible. So it feels like there's more for us to do, in a sense, if that makes sense, if that's in any way an answer. So as you can see, I'm still reacting in that way. I don't know what you think, Sean, about that.
Sean, what are your thoughts on that?
I'm still reacting to kind of like, maybe I'm just trying to project the person back into the, making sure I'm reinstating the human, and that may be part of my reaction.
Yeah, no, I think your reaction is a common one. I'm hearing more discussion, as I said, about the need to keep humans in the loop and remind us that we still need that human element. And what you're talking about, particularly with writing and photography, obviously it's being very disruptive, generative AI, from Midjourney to ChatGPT. You're already hearing stories of copy editors and advertisers generating their content now, not going with writers. So there is that disruption, and it will displace jobs in that sense. But I think what we're also learning is, as I mentioned earlier, if you kind of what you're touching on is now there's a possibility of us developing a little bit of higher order thinking skills and making use of generative AI to enhance those skills or even augment those skills. So in a sense, you can augment your metacognition, right? You can make it think about thinking as you're using the AI tools, and then it will reinforce how you're thinking about approaching a problem, for example, or creating something new. So it will be a co-designer in that sense. And as I think these tools become a lot more sophisticated, and they weed out the hallucinations, and they might be a little bit more accurate, and they get rid of all of the bias. Like there's still problems in the data sets and how they generate content. There's bias in a lot of the content. Midjourney, for example, there's a lot of bias in the images that it generates. Bing as well. What we can do is remind ourselves that it can augment all those things that we were able to do before without the aid of these tools, but perhaps make them a little bit more complex. That might even add more work, and it will probably create new types of work that we really know will exist in the next couple of years. I don't know. It's an interesting time in that sense.
I think, it's a different thing. And again, this is a side quest, so I only want to sort of name it here and sort of then leave it. But I think certainly when it comes to the image making, like at the moment, for me, the excitement around, I was hearing a guy won in the UK, won a photography competition recently, and it was revealed that the photograph itself had been generated by AI. And so he was referring to something called promptography. So, he was coining that phrase, promptography. And I think the queasiness around it, partly it is to do, I think, around a lot of creative people, I think, around that sense of suddenly, well, the link between effort, sort of hours and effort, and sort of experiences perhaps being uncoupled because you can sort of get these things quicker. But the other thing is about, at this point, it is to do, I think, with the consent of where the reservoir of imagery is coming from, so who it belongs to, and I think that what you're seeing is because creative people are often sort of have traditionally been underpaid and undervalued, that creativity is just something that has been commodified. I think that idea that some of these tools are drawing on reservoirs of people's work without consent is where some of that reaction lives. It's not, I think some of the, on LinkedIn, there are people are so excited about it. And the question of the provenance of where that reservoir comes from, I think, has been an interesting one, and I think will be sorted out in the courts probably in the end around copyright law and so on and so forth. But I don't want to. That's very specifically about image making and creativity. But I think there are sidebars there around, of course, intellectual copyright and where the ideas live, and this think about, this utopia of all ideas are for sharing, particularly in learning design. Everything should be shared. And at the same time, there's that idea about intellectual copyright and where ideas live and the provenance of ideas, and that being something important or valuable, and how do you keep stock of that, in a sense? How do you maintain those ideas? So I don't want to sort of send us all off down, because that's the immediate reaction path when it comes to this stuff. People thinking about the provenance of their own efforts and their own ideas just somehow being added up to make this collective thing. So it's like sharing versus property in a way, which is a classic opposition, right?
Yeah. You're reminding me of the early 80s and 90s when some rappers and hip hop bands were being criticized for remixing.
Sampling, remixing, exactly, yeah.
Exactly, yeah. It's a similar issue.
Yeah.
You mentioned higher order thinking skills, Sean, because this is, I think this is a very interesting area in terms of how does AI change how we think about learning, teaching, learning design, and if so, how does it change? And this idea of higher order thinking skills feels super important, because if we make the assumption that AI is powerful enough to have an impact on what we're doing, which it clearly is, what are some of these higher order thinking skills, and then how do we start to design for them? What does that look like to you?
Well, let me backtrack a little bit and give reference to a study. I mean, some studies are starting to come out, and I think we'll see more better studies coming out in the future. But right now, people are rushing out to get something. But one of them I read recently was showing how ChatGPT, for example, benefited those who usually are poor at communication, but really good at ideation and problem solving. Right. And because they quite often you have people they're very good at having these wonderful ideas or understanding problems, but they're unable to communicate them very well. And now you have this tool that can assist you with articulating your thoughts, and it can assist you with analyzing a problem. And if you have an understanding and you can define the problem already, it just makes it so much better for you as a person who couldn't communicate them very well in the first place. So I find that's kind of interesting, right? So it will empower some people, and not just people who aren't good at communicating, but different languages, for example, right? Let's set aside now the concern that people will say, well, we don't have to learn languages anymore. But it is there to help you communicate complex ideas. Other higher order of thinking I think that it might help with are things like, as I mentioned, analytical thinking. I've been following Ethan Mollick. He's out of the United States. Which university? I can't remember now. I think it's Wharton. Anyway, he's been experimenting with ChatGPT and a plugin, an extension of that, where you upload. I don't have access to this because it's just in an alpha stage, but I've been following what he's been doing, and you just upload a data set, an Excel sheet, and it will analyze that data any way you want it to, create visualizations of that, and even describe its methodology and how it does that. All right. Now, from the perspective of us, well, how can that help us with our own analytical thinking? Well, in a learning design exercise, you can perhaps set up stages where you get students to walk through the process with the tool, right, and reflect on what it's doing and discuss what it's doing, and teaching the analytical thinking through the AI, right? Because these are all useful skills. More and more reports, like from OECD, World Economic Forum, they keep on coming out with reports that say, like World Economic Forum just released one in May, saying that analytical thinking, creative thinking, critical thinking are still the top type of skills that are needed around the world. And that's what employers are looking for, less so on knowledge retention. And when I think about students who are often graduating from universities, not all right, I don't want to generalize, but you do get a large group of students who probably were very good at knowledge retention. But what employers, in my discussion with employers, often comes back is they're not good at problem solving. They're not good at communicating those problems or identifying what the problem is and thinking in complex ways. Right. And what I'm seeing with AI right now, generative AI, is it can be a really good tool to assist with complex thinking.
I mean, and I totally agree with that. And I think what's so interesting about what you were saying there is that, and Tony will smile wryly about this, because I'm always looking for something, and it's like a ridiculous quest, but always looking for sort of what might be described as irreducible ideas as opposed to synonyms for an idea that already exists. So it's like getting into the weeds of something. So and I haven't made up my mind yet if AI is the weeds, because in the same way that, as you said, when sort of like music artists were sampling, and that was like and or like when the radio was invented or the printing press, you have these moral panics around new technologies. And yet the thing you was talking about there about it's the sort of the ability for individual to get their head above the water, to get out of the weeds. And this is with knowledge in general. So knowledge retention is knowledge is the weeds, and then getting your head above the weeds is the analytical thinking, to sort of say that's important. That's so it's like getting out of the weeds. And I can still remember when I was about 17 and I was doing my A-levels, and I remember my A-level, it was English language A-level, and I was in this terrible old porter cabin in my school, and we had this particular teacher who was this little guy, little sort of red-headed guy, really sort of fiery, very political. And I remember his class because we were talking about, it was media studies, and he was talking about how the newspapers in the UK were demonstrably either on the left or the right of the political spectrum, right? And I remember going, what? Because newspapers, up until that point in my brain, I think, were just all the same, in so much as that they were transparent vessels for expressing the facts of the world. And this one member of staff just said, they're not that. They're like, they're composites of opinion. They're pulling what's important. They're synthesizing news stories in a particular way for a particular thing. And I remember that was the beginning of my higher level thinking. I remember thinking, so the point of this is that I just wonder if what we need, or what we really, the irreducible concept here, is that learners need to be journalists first. A journalist is somebody who, always checks their sources and is always looking for what the story is. So a journalist is a great example of someone who, there's an investigative element there. There's like a not taking things at face value. And that graduate you describe who's more than just retaining knowledge, but is also then having a more critical, creative relationship to it. That, to me, that feels like an irreducible skill set, and AI is in support of that, if you know what I mean. Just as the internet was in support of that when that was a thing, and just as more than one television channel was in support of that. It always, to me, it feels like, is AI in the weeds, and what you're talking about is the position of the human that is always paramount and was ever thus, if you know what I mean.
You got me thinking a lot here, and I'm coming back now to what we were talking about earlier about keeping the human in the loop. I think we have to be very careful too, as we are discussing this, that you still need that expert to vet the information that it generates, right? Because the students, depending on their levels or their age or what they're learning, won't always know, right? They'll still need that guidance from the teacher, and you need that learning design embedded into the course so that you're scaffolding their experience well enough, right? And there's checkpoints and stages. But what we're talking about here is really just think of it as a tool that needs to be vetted, right? It's a tool that needs to be scrutinized a lot right now because it will hallucinate and generate things. For example, one of the things that we did in our center, some of my colleagues, they're looking at how far it will go in hallucinating. And I think it was Bing. I can't remember which tool they use now, but they just wanted to ask what was the biggest scandal that HKUST has ever gone through. And it listed up a bunch of scandals that never happened, but it did so confidently, and even named real professors and the scandals that they were involved in. Right. So while we talk about the potential for it to be very useful for higher order thinking, and I think it does. I think it has a lot of potential. We have to be very mindful at the moment that it will generate a lot of garbage as well.
But do you think there's ever a point when? So this is a big question here, Sean. I apologise, probably completely off topic, but the idea that there's a point when the technology is such that it can produce like translucency, like utter, like truth. So the idea that it's the repository of truth. In other words, it's not hallucinating. It can't do that anymore. It can only transmit the real. Do you think that to me that seems that's predicated upon a notion of like objective reality? So we know that water is wet and fire is hot. There are certain realities that are, you might say, incontestable in that respect. They have an objective status. They can't be argued, but a lot of other stuff is up for grabs, and we've seen that. We're living through this point now where I think we're out of the age of reason and out of the age of enlightenment by a long way, and we are in the age of hallucination. If you think about COVID conspiracy, Trumpian politics, popularism, we're in the age of hallucination where you can say what you like and it carries weight. And so I think that it's not just AI that's hallucinating right now, but the idea that can that technology ever produce? Can it ever be trustworthy in so much as that would suggest that there is a finite, final expression of truth that's available to us? There's a big question. Sorry about that.
Yeah, no, it's
a big question.
Well, we need more philosophers and ethicists to come into this debate, right? Because I think right now their perspectives, they'll be the best ones to answer these types of questions. I mean, the whole concept of absolute truth, is there an absolute truth, is debatable, right? Especially when you go across cultures and perspectives and societies, right? And at the moment, when we think about AI, how it's designed, it's based on recorded human knowledge, right? So data sets are made by recorded human knowledge. Then it's trained by a particular group of people from a particular society and culture on how to analyze and interpret that knowledge. And then they set the content policy. They design the technology that does all this. So right away, even if unintentional, we have bias in what it's going to say, right? Yeah. So I highly doubt that it can ever. This is why humans will always be better at this, right? We have more contextual awareness, I think, than an AI will ever be able to have, or in its current form, at least, anyway. We have more contextual awareness, and AI doesn't. So
yeah, I mean that's Sorry, Tony. Go.
I find that really interesting, the whole idea of context, because this has always been, ever since the inception of AI, 20, 30 years ago, and the concept of it, this idea of context has always been the big problem in terms of how contextually aware can an AI be. But I was thinking this the other day, because if you look at, I was going to pick on ChatGPT because it's on the tip of my tongue, but the amount of reference points that it draws on when it's making a query, it's drawing on sort of 175 billion points of data or something like that for every query, which is that more or less than I'm drawing on as a human? Because I did have this sort of moment where I was thinking, okay, I would like to think that I'm more contextually aware just because I'm an adult human being with 46 years of life experience, but I'm not drawing probably on 175 billion data points when I make a decision.
Yeah, that's true.
So why is an AI not as contextually aware? And I know there's the obvious ones around, it's not in inverted commas conscious, but if I'm trying to plan a program of learning, I'm limited to the information that I have, and I can do searches and I can find out things, and I would like to think that I do that better than an AI, but actually I'm not using anywhere near as much data as an AI. So is there an argument to say that it is more contextually aware because it's got access to more context than I could ever possibly have?
Mm-hmm. Yes, in that sense. I mean, you're absolutely right that it has access to more knowledge and context in that sense. And this is what I think, going back to earlier where I said that it can augment certain learning experiences and allow us to explore things in new contexts. So it's very good in that sense, right? But again, it's just a recorded context, right? Of course, Bing's hooked up to the internet, so it's more immediate and more up to date in that sense, whereas ChatGPT isn't. But it won't know the context of your workplace. It won't know the context of your relationship, of the problems and the people that you're dealing with within your own immediate personal space or workplace and so on. All right, so you still need to make that judgment. But if you're talking about simulating things into different contexts, so it can do that. Right, but you still need that human judgment to be able to say, well, okay, it worked in this context according to ChatGPT, but knowing my own coworkers or knowing my students or knowing their situation, will this work in that sense, right? Because it won't be aware of them. It won't have that contextual awareness. So, I mean, it's easy to fall into these black and white kind of arguments when we're talking about the impact of generative AI, and I find myself falling into it a lot as well, right? Because this is how our minds work quite often. We like to be lazy in our thought and just say yes or no. But I think it's a lot more complex than that. We have to remind ourselves that how AI could be used for both good and bad is quite a complex thing.
Yeah,
that's a really interesting point, and you're right that an AI won't know our immediate context. And I think this is, if we sort of bring it back to learning design specifically, when you're designing an experience, a learning experience, Phil and I make a big case that the first thing you do is empathize. So empathy is the irreducible concept. You empathize with who are the learners, how old are they, what's their background, where are they from, what prior knowledge do they have, what are they coming in with, where are we trying to move them to? And then you can start to build the learning experience. But yes, only the person who's going to be designing that experience will have that contextual knowledge, arguably. So I suppose with that in mind, what are some of the guiding principles, I suppose? How should educators, learning designers, teachers, lecturers start using AI on that basis? If we know that AI is here, it's not going to go away, but we're still, whatever your role in education or learning design, you're still designing those learning experiences. So I suppose what I'm saying is, in many ways, what should be the starting off point before we go very far into designing a learning experience? What questions should we be asking ourselves? At what point should we try and plug AI into that process of learning design? I empathize with my students. I know what the learning outcomes are. Then at some point, I've got to figure out how I'm going to think about bringing AI into the learning design, to building the stuff, to the assessment. So what are some of the guiding principles around that learning design process, would you say, Sean?
Well, I think the first thing is always just refer back to your normal process in learning design and think about, well, which tools will help students through the learning experience so that they can achieve those learning outcomes. And don't start with AI. Right? That's just like any other technology or any other tool that we use in teaching and learning. You don't start with that. You start out with, what is it that I want my students to learn? What are the intended learning outcomes? And then you design backwards in that sense. And eventually, how do I measure those outcomes? And how do I have the experience so that they're able to have input, experience it, learn it, get feedback, reflect, and that sort of thing. And then you can think, well, will AI augment that? Will it help me transform that experience so it enhances the learning experience so they're able to reflect better, or maybe they're able to have something to assist them through a thinking process, right? I think there's a danger of coming up with a one-size-fits-all kind of principle when we're talking about this tool, right? Because sometimes you don't want them to touch AI. You want them to go through the experience without using the tool, right? So it really depends on what it is that you want them to learn, in what context you want them to learn, and how you want to measure that, right? I think these are the principles we have to remind ourselves, which really isn't all that undifferent when we look at other tools, right? And I have a bit of a fear in the sense that kind of like when Cahoots came out. I don't know if you remember, right? I walk in and almost every classroom, a teacher's using Cahoots, but there's no pedagogical design on why they're using it, right? It's just because it's a new tool, it's innovative, right? It's novel. And so we'll probably have that with AI tools as well, right? Because it's so novel, a lot of people will be using it. But why? You have to ask yourself first. I think that's
the example. I think of you see this happen all the time, where, and it's often, to be honest, you're driven by FOMO, fear of missing out, a sense of like to present as up to date, and I think it happens very quickly in educational institutions, because I think broadly they often feel that they're on the back foot. So I sometimes think, oh, we can present as innovative if we use this tool, and then sometimes I see it happen all the time where the wisdom of the thing is replaced by the tool. So that, as you say, so in a learning design point, you've got the reason for using the tool, which should be driving some kind of more transformative outcome. But you often see that the whole session is about sort of being enthralled to a tool. It's like, interactive. I worked with a brilliant visiting lecturer who was using interactive technologies with my students way before anyone else was, and sort of like sort of Mentimeter light kind of stuff. And he was doing it to bring his subject to life. And I think he was interested in technology, but he was a brilliant teacher. And so he basically ensured that the tail wasn't wagging the dog in that sense. But yes, you can absolutely see, can't you, where you can start to see it creeping into people's promotional brochures about, we're using this, or the first degree course that's in ChatGPT. It's a bit like, I think my heart would die. I think my heart would break the moment that I see a sort of a 3-year degree program. Not around exploring it, but I don't know. You see what I'm saying? It will come. You're right, where the tail will wag the dog on this one, because it is just it reminds me so much of when Photoshop first arrived, right? And I remember when I was working with students, Photoshop had these particular filters, and one of them was lens flare. And you could add a lens. In post, you could add a lens flare to anything, and the lens flare. There was a point when we actually, as sort of learning designers, we had to sort of ban the lens flare because it had become synonymous with what digital artwork looks like, and it was because Photoshop had produced a kind of a tool, or like an output that everybody liked and walked into, and for a couple of years there, it was like lens flare-tastic everywhere. Lens flare, and you realised that lens flare was becoming a goal in its own right. It replaced the question, which was like, does my image need this? It was like, we've got a tool that can produce this effect, so we're going to use it. And I wonder if there will be, in terms of the quality of writing, or the texture of writing, or the texture of work, if there will be an equivalent of the ChatGPT lens flare, or, you know what I'm saying? It's like, oh, that's a tell, that's the tool doing the work. So I don't know, but that was my experience of when sort of an automation came in that began to feel more important and more sexy than the questions that the work was answering, in a sense.
Well, on that point, I just wanted to follow on from that and ask you a question, Sean. I know you're advising your university about AI and policy around AI, but if we focus specifically on assessment, to follow on with what Phil was saying, I mean, should AI change assessment? Because there's lots of talk about, the essay's dead, blah blah blah, very reactionary. But I mean, are they good arguments in your view? How should we respond in terms of assessment design in an AI enabled world?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think anyone in the world has the definitive answer yet, but I think, again, coming back to the point where we always like to make things black and white, we can't with the whole idea of assessments, right? We need to rethink assessments. Yes, true, right? But we also need to rethink our course design, and in the sense of, well, what is it that we want students to learn, and how do we measure that learning? Let's take a look at language proficiency, for example, is one example, right? If I really want to measure your proficiency in writing as a second language acquisition, like, as a second language learner, maybe having a pen and paper closed book exam is still needed, right? In that sense, right? Because if I allow them to do an essay, they can easily, and students will do this. I've talked to some students where they tell us that, oh, to trick it, turn it in, and all the other tools, I'll use ChatGPT to generate it, and then I'll give it to Bing to regenerate it, and then I'll give it to the other one to regenerate it, so it won't be able to catch. And so you'll always have students who will try to cheat. So yes, if you're really concerned with the proficiency, maybe pen and paper might be best in that sense. But then if you just go back to all pen and paper, then you're limiting their learning experiences in different ways, right? It's not a real world authentic type of task. Are they able to generate writing for something that's authentic in a real world, right? Because when they go out in the working world, they'll use it to help them with their writing. Okay, so then you need to think about, well, maybe we need to do a mix in our assessments, do a process. And there's multiple ways. Again, it comes back to, what is it you want them to learn? How do you want to measure that outcome? One way you could is flip the exam around. I mean, I'm toying around with these ideas myself, right? And I don't know if they work or not. But you can flip the exam around. Instead of having a final exam in a course, right? You give them a midterm and a short series of short quizzes at the beginning, closed book, right? Then you're able to identify the gaps in their knowledge and their knowing early, right? And it's authentic. It's their individual, no help from ChatGPT. And then from there, then you go through a PBLT kind of process, or a problem solving, or a project-based approach, or something like that, where then they can start using ChatGPT. And both you and them they've identified their gaps in their knowledge or their skills early in the game. And now there's less of this urge to memorize things and beat the exam at the end. They're actually going through a learning process. Or another possibility is you can take a design thinking based approach to assessments, where you have them empathize with the stakeholders for a project as a group, and then they define the problem as a group, right? A group of 4 students, right? And they're allowed to use generative AI while they're trying to identify a problem, but they have to document it. Then they ideate, they brainstorm, they document it as a group. Then they write a draft or a prototype as a group. Then after they've written the draft, then they individually go into an exam setting, and they have to write pen and paper, the revised paper, right? But there's still scaffolding, there's collaboration, they're using generative AI to test higher order thinking, but then they have a pen and paper type of task at the end where it's truly their work, right? But it probably was assisted with the process before. So these are different models that we can explore, and I'm sure there's many more. I mean, you could do away with essays altogether, but if you really want to see whether or not they can write an essay, usually the essay, it's the purpose is you want to see whether or not they can synthesize ideas, formulate an argument, support an argument properly, right? That's the whole purpose, right? The 5-paragraph essay, no one writes that outside of school anymore anyway. So it's a very long answer to your question, because I think it's very complex.
I mean, just as you were talking, I was reminded, because Tony and I, we talk about this all the time, and for me, and again, I'm like a parrot here, but for me, the question that when you're learning design, when you're building out a bit of learning design, and learning design for me is a bucket word now that I've learned from Tony, just to describe all of the stuff that you have to think about in order to produce an effective experience in the head of someone else. So learning design never quite captures the box of fireworks that I think is actually what we're actually trying to do. But for me, the question I was always answering was, what does power look like? How do you make people powerful? And for me, the essay, for example, as you've just expressed there, which was to do with higher order thinking and actually the ability to compete in the world using language, was to me a discrete and powerful skill set. The written word, the ability to write a compelling email, the ability to do all of those things, the ability to be taken seriously. For me, it was never about like the Harvard method. It was about, I'm going to give you the suit and the shoes by which you can compete in these forums with other people who perhaps came from better universities, more middle-class families, where these skills were a given. So when it comes to sort of like the ChatGPT, using these tools, and as you described, that really nice cascade of different types of activities that were kind of building up into a final thing, for me, it would always come down to, what is the power that you're trying to impart? Like, how are you powerful in the workplace? And if the answer to that is that in order to be really powerful in the 21st century workplace, you have to be able to use prompts, or you have to have a compelling literacy around AI, then that would instantly inform why you were putting those activities. But if at the same time you felt that the metacognitive power was the ability to be a critical thinker and the ability to go off grid and unplug, and your brain and your thoughts still be available to you, and your ability to express them was still yours and didn't live other to you. Because I think that's the other thing, that with AI, the idea of that your knowledge and your skills are being othered in a way, it's sort of slightly outsourced. It's a bit like, I would want to ensure that they had an experience too of where they drew that in and they knew that it was within them. So I think that cascade of activities where it was partly them, partly this, to me is a really great expression of keeping people powerful. It's like, you need this in the workplace because that's how it's done, but you are you, and you need to know why you are operating in the way that you are. So there are certain activities which the pen and the paper are going to remind you and put you in touch with the fact that you are powerful. So that's, I mean, Tony's smiling, but that is for me often like, ask for what you want, and what you want should be in the image of what power looks like for your learners. How do you keep them powerful? How do you keep them relevant? So you'd absolutely have to have AI, using AI as scaffolding, because that's going to happen, right? That's what they're going to do when they leave. So to ignore it, or to pretend that it's not happening, would be to lose power from your learners, to take power from them, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. Tony, yeah, sorry, you were going to say something?
No, I was just going to say, just to round that off, really, I really like this term, you've used it, and I've seen others use it, AI literacy, and it does feel like, to follow on from what Phil was saying, that to use a phrase, you can't put the genie back in the box. So we know that we've got to work with AI. Through this conversation has been super useful to sort of identify where power does lie, again, to follow on from what Phil was saying. And I suppose probably just to bring us to some sort of conclusion around this is, what does AI literacy look like for you? What does an AI-enabled graduate look like? What does someone who can do this well look like? They come out of university, they're fully equipped with all the skills that they need. What does an AI-enabled graduate look like? Okay, what is AI literacy?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. And there's a lot of people doing good work in this area. Professor Locken is one, George Siemens is another. A lot of researchers that are exploring what is AI literacy. And I think Professor Locken, she uses the term AI ready, right? Because when we think of AI literacy, you're thinking about the technical tools, right? And how it works. And I understand that how the data set's collected, how it's the algorithms work. I understand the bias. I understand all of the capabilities of the tool, right? So that's my AI literacy. But does that mean I'm AI ready? What you're kind of getting at, for the working world, for the learning experience, am I AI ready? Because it goes beyond just understanding the tool, but also understanding its social implications, right? In some ways, you could think of AI, some of these chatbots, as being agents. They have agency. They're not humans, but they're human-like. They have agency, right? So if we have a community of inquiry, how does that disrupt the community of inquiry if it's being treated like an agent within that community or in a social system, right? So understanding the social implications of AI that it's going to have, understanding how it's going to impact my own thinking, my metacognition, how I approach things, right? And then also understanding how it's going to, in a sense, have impact on social meaning making, right? So in collaboration and that. And then finally coming back to what we were talking about earlier, understanding, well, when is the human needed, right? At what point are they needed? When do they step in? So am I AI ready in that sense, understanding all these implications so that I can make the best choices to bring in the right tool for the learning experience or in the workplace. I think it was George Siemens that said, he said AI is going to change everything. And there was that argument before when MOOCs first came out, right, way back in the 2013, 2012, and George Siemens was part of that movement as well. And but he makes the argument that he believes that this time it will change everything because AI is embedded in every system. It will be embedded across systems. We can't get away from it. Especially once, well, you see now, we were just talking about earlier before we went live, it's in Skype already, it's in the web browsers, right? They're going to integrate it into the Microsoft Office suite. Pretty soon you have a Teams meeting and it will generate meeting notes and put them in themes based on how you want them. And then it will take the meeting notes and generate a PowerPoint slide for you, right? So that's what's coming in the not so distant future. And once that's out, we have to ask ourselves, well, how is that going to impact how we interact with each other, how we interact with knowledge, right? How we interact with the tools themselves, and what implications those have on multiple levels. And to me, that's just as important as just AI literacy and understanding the technical aspects of the tools.
Can I just, I know Tony's trying to wind us up, I think, not wind us up, provoke us, but sort of wind us up. But I want to ask you then, what do you think that an AI disempowered learner would look like? Where, you know, how does disempowerment, how might disempowerment manifest for some, you know, how might AI produce other conditions or I don't know, what's the word, enshrine the enshrine problems or lock things in or bake issues in? Where do you feel that there's some discussion there around how it might work against learners or work with learners' lesser instincts around what knowledge acquisition is for or what it's like, if you know what I mean?
Yeah, I think there's a bit of a danger of creating echo chambers, right? I think there's a danger of it. We talked earlier that it has a wealth of knowledge of context, yes, but again, there's still bias in that context, right? Think of the underrepresented cultures, Native American cultures and their languages. Is it in there? Is it in that data set? I don't think so, right? Colleagues at my center, again, they're experimenting with this. They asked very simple questions. Who is the most influential author of all time? Who is the most influential dancer? And then they asked this, I like this question, who's the most, was it prominent or influential? I can't remember the verb now, but pirate was of all time. And unsurprisingly, it gave all Western male pirates. And it totally missed the fact that probably one of the most prominent pirates of all time was a female Chinese pirate.
Yeah.
And so I guess coming back to your question, it's going to disempower people potentially right now in its current form, disempower the minority groups. It's going to disempower certain groups because the bias is already in the data set and it's going to reiterate that bias. So it's again, there is a bit of a worry here, and it will create more disinformation, misinformation.
Yeah. Do you think as well that I think again, Tony, you know, roll your eyes all you like, but when I work with learners all the time, and I do a lot of teaching with young people, and so I'm very fond of learners, but I also refuse to romanticize learners. So I would say the majority of learners that I meet to begin with are strategic learners. They're often learning because they have been told to. They're often learning because they think that if they learn something, it will get them a job. All of those things are important. It's not a either or, but I would say that the majority of learners are strategic, in so much as that they are learning just because they want it to transform another thing in their lives. Fine. So, but sometimes that strategic learning is if I pass this test, or if I, in other words, the knowledge is slipping through them. It's not. It's sort of the way I would say this. It's like peristalsis. That a lot of strategic learners are receiving content, metabolizing that content, leaving the content, because for them it's not about the content, it's about presenting as having metabolized the content, and now they can move on and get their thing. So and I love learners, but I see that all the time. So strategic learners. So I worry about, so if we romance learners around AI, I think we risk that notion that there's a demographic of learners where they meet a bit of resistance, sometimes that's the beginning of where the learning starts to change a bit, and it starts to be a more embodied experience. And so sometimes I worry, if I'm having a sort of a gloomier day around AI, I worry about that it's a strategic learner's charter, in a sense. And I know that would all be mitigated by good learning design, but I worry about all the bad learning design. I worry about all the kind of the factories of the qualification factories. I think about the peristalsis model of education, where people go in and content passes through them and then they move on, and like no change took place. And I wonder if AI is like a charter, an endorsement, an acceleration of strategic learning, if it's done badly, or indeed done very well. I don't know what your thoughts are on that, on that utopia idea versus how people actually use the business of getting educated. You know, there's a business of being educated. It's got nothing to do with learning, in a way.
I work in a society where it's very exam oriented, right? Our DSC in K to 12 structure, it's all about getting the good grades, right? Yeah. And then same with university, it's about the GPA, and so you're right. Learners are strategic quite often, and yes, it could either encourage that behavior if we have bad learning design, or if we have good learning design, mitigate it. And I think, to me, I'm trying to be optimistic, and I'm hoping that with the emergence of AI, it's going to wake up this common practice that our current form of education isn't good, especially in areas like Hong Kong, where it's so exam oriented and there's very little about learning experiences. There's people doing good work, but predominantly there isn't. So I'm hoping it's just getting us to rethink things, but the foundations of education are solid. Right? It's very difficult to change things, because it's not just teachers saying, I want to change. A lot of this behavior is perpetuated within families, right? Yeah. Right. So it's the roots are deeper than just the school foundations.
Phil, Sean, I'm going to bring it to a close there. Thank you very much for a wide-ranging discussion on the relationship of AI with learning design. Lots more questions than answers, which is as it should be, but also some really great practical tips in there. So thank you both very much for joining me to share your thoughts on that today. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you. Enjoyed the conversation.
Right, I'm going to press stop, and then I'm going to curse LinkedIn Live for not actually working, but at least we recorded it. So
I think it is live.
It's live, but there's